Now, given the state of the games and the availability of poker training out there, I'm assuming that pretty much everyone watching this doesn't need to be told that being in position is good and being out of position is bad. Well, I don't know about you, but that seems a little bit too general for me, especially given that basically every book or PLO video I've ever seen talks about how position is more important in PLO than any other poker game, which is why it's surprising to me that when I ask players why position is so important in PLO, they have a hard time giving me a good answer. So, if you've already mastered everything there is to know about using position, then you can go ahead and skip this part. But just in case you're not, I've broken down what I consider to be the 5 most important reasons for why position is valuable to us in PLO. They are number 1, extracting value, number 2, bluffing, number 3, pot control, number 4, equity realization, and number 5, getting to showdown. Now, we're going to spend some extra time talking about position because it's definitely the most important out of the big 3, so it's crucial that we get on the same page before we go any further. So, the first thing we're going to talk about is extracting value. Now, anybody that knows anything about making money playing PLO will tell you that the majority of your profits, especially at the mid and lower stakes, comes from basically just getting the maximum value when you're supposed to from your hands. This is way easier to do when we're in position because we have more information about what our opponents have. So a lot of hands, like one pair hands for example, that are easy check folds out of position become easy value bets when we're in position. If you've read any PLO books or watched training videos, you've obviously heard coaches say that many players would benefit a lot from tightening up out of position. And the big reason for this is because even if you're getting the right odds or immediate price pre-flop on a given hand, the chances that you'll actually get to realize your equity or get value from your hand when you do flop well is pretty small. Or, more simply put, your 2 options are to check fold or bet and not get paid. Sounds like you're getting ripped off in my opinion. And I have an entire section devoted to the psychology of position, which we'll discuss later on in the lesson. But for now, I just want to mention that a big piece of our strategy is centered around playing pots with the fish, or the weaker opponents at the table. Now, getting value out of the fish is definitely your biggest source of profit, and whether you're in position or out of position matters a lot less against them, since they generally play poorly and won't put you in many tough spots regardless of the action. But as you move up in stakes and the players get better, you'll find yourself battling with more competent regs and trickier fish, so you won't be able to play very many hands out of position, which means you need to learn how to get the most value out of your hands when you're in position. And last, value betting thinly is a topic that's covered in a lot of detail in the river lessons, but here I just want to point out that value betting thinly is a huge source of profit, but it's much harder to do when you're out of position. As we'll talk about in the river lesson, generally most players play more straightforwardly on the river than they should, and it's much easier to take advantage of this when we're in position than when we're out of position. Alright, so remember back to core PLO concept number 6, where I talked about the 3 reasons for betting. Do you remember what they were? Alright, I'll make it easy on you. They were for value, making worse hands call, bluffing, making a better hand fold, and protection, or in other words, making hands with a lot of equity fold. Now, the money we make from bluffing in PLO comes in a variety of ways, but by now it shouldn't surprise you that bluffing is a lot easier to do when we're in position. First, we have infinitely more opportunities to steal pots when we're in position. We can open when we're in late position and steal the blinds, or we can limp behind with our marginal hands and easily steal multi-way pots when nobody else shows interest, both of which are harder to do or even unavailable to us when we're out of position. And beyond these more obvious steal spots, floating and repping scare cards that peel off on later streets are both viable options that are way more effective if we're in position than when we're out of position. Okay, sure. There's spots where floating someone out of position, or donking the turn, or check raising the turn on scared cards is profitable. But let's be honest with ourselves. It's definitely harder to pull off because, again, you don't have as much information when you're out of position, so the scare card you're trying to represent could easily have hit your opponent as well. And once you get better at hand reading and taking good lines, I think you'll understand how big of a role the ability to represent hands has on your bottom line. For example, Omaha has 16,432 distinct starting hands, while Hold'em only has 169. So, especially given the state of the games right now, where people have difficulty hand reading and are still learning, you can make your opponent's life pretty terrible if you know how to rep hands well. Next, controlling the size of the pot is probably the most underrated and even misunderstood aspect for the benefits of having position. Now, another big concept we'll be referring to a lot throughout QuickPro is how it's important to start building pots with your big hands on the early streets. But using the same reasoning, it's equally important to not build big pots with medium strength hands. And a lot of hand histories I get tend to be tough spots on the turn or river where the student has barreled the flop, gotten called, and now they can't decide what to do when the turn gets ugly or their bet gets raised. You know what I usually say? Well, don't play bad hands out of position in the first place. Nah, I'm exaggerating a little, because obviously you have to play out of position sometimes, but we'll talk a lot about hand selection and opening ranges next lesson. Well, you're probably thinking to yourself, man, this PLO stuff sounds easy. Bet the max and we have the stones and check the medium part of our range and then just fold our air. I'm going to be rich. Casino Crime, you're a genius, dude. Not so fast. The problem most players have is they have a lot of trouble identifying what a medium strength hand is in the first place, or more specifically, they invest too much money early in the hand with hands that really only have one or two streets of value or playability. I see a hand like middle pair and a small flush draw, or top and middle pair, and think it's the nuts because they're used to no limit. And something else that's similar is players who first start playing PLO like to get all the money in on the flop with medium strength hands, regardless of how deep the stacks are. I'm not sure if they like getting the money in quick because they're afraid of getting outdrawn, or maybe they're just used to railing higher stakes games where the games are more aggressive and stack off ranges are wider. But the easiest example of this is players who like to get all the money in on the flop with sets on wet boards when they're in position and the SPR is still really high. And as a side note, you should definitely note the players who get their money in light when they're deep, because in the long run, those are the guys who will end up buying you a lot of nice things. Anyway, there's a couple of hand histories at the end of the lesson that go into more detail about all of this, so I'll save that conversation for later. Last, and we'll talk a lot about this later on in the lesson and in the post-flop section, controlling the size of the pot and leveraging your stack matters a lot as stack sizes go up. Being in position with a lot of money behind gives you the ability to gather the most information from your opponents over all of the streets, which makes it more likely that you'll take the most positive EV line against him. Alright, the fourth reason why position is important has to do with equity realization. And equity realization is basically a fancy way of describing our ability to stay in the hand until all the cards are dealt, or in most cases, our ability to check back and take a free card when we know our opponent probably won't fold to a bet, but we have 30 to 35% equity against his range. Now, recall for a second that our biggest objective isn't just to realize as much equity as possible, but to block our opponent's equity as well. Doing both of these things is much easier to do in position, and practically impossible to do out of position against competent opponents. Weaker players will obviously make more mistakes against us by checking back the flop and turn too much, but even against them, our ability to realize our equity is reduced by a lot. Which is why the situation you want to avoid the most in PLO is check calling out of position with a medium strength hand or draw. Check calling out of position is a losing play for many reasons, but mainly it all comes back to building up big pots just to give up on them later, or even worse, building up big pots just to lose a stack later on to a better hand. And we'll be bringing this up a bunch during QuickPro, and I think that once you check out the hand histories after the lesson, you'll get a better idea of exactly why playing passively out of position with medium strength hands and draws is a big leak. So this kind of goes along with pot control, but another reason why having a positional advantage on your opponents kicks so much ass is being able to check and show down a winner. It's a beautiful thing, right? You finally get to the river, your opponent checks, and you have the option to put in a value bet, a bluff, or just check behind and show down the winner. Now, when you're out of position, getting to showdown profitably becomes a little trickier, and you're basically at the mercy of whoever has position on you. Anybody who's played PLO has definitely been in a spot where they've potted the flop and the turn with a set or two pair, gotten called by someone in position, and then felt completely lost on what to do when the river fills the straight or the flush draw. So, put in layman's terms, when you're out of position going to the river, our options are greatly reduced, and you really only have a couple of choices. You can stick in a blocker bet, or check and hope your opponent's friendly and checks back with you. In either case, you're in danger of facing a large bet or raise, which puts you in a lot of weird spots that'll ultimately increase the likelihood that you make a mistake and lose some money. So, I didn't really have any particular reason for putting a picture of Sigmund Freud on here, other than the fact that he's the only famous psychologist I could think of off the top of my head, which is kind of sad, I guess, but what are you going to do? But beyond the five main categories that I showed you for why position is important, there's one more thing I'd like to point out that I think most books and videos don't talk about enough, and that's the psychology, or I guess more importantly, the way that being either in position or out of position affects the mindset and tendencies of your opponents, and more importantly, how we can apply this knowledge and use it to our advantage. So, what's people's perception of PLO anyway? Personally, I think it's hilarious how when you tell someone that knows a little bit about poker that you play PLO for a living, they view you as this like big gambler action junkie guy. They're like, "Dude, isn't there a ton of variance in that game? Are you sure you want to do this? Are you sure you can handle this?" I feel like I just told them that I'm about to do the running of the bulls or that I'm thinking of trying some super addictive designer drug or something. But I guess to an extent, they're right. There is more action in PLO, and the pots are bigger. So I guess that if people are under the impression that no limit is the Cadillac of poker, then I'd say that PLO is probably more like a Ferrari, right? I mean, have you ever played PLO in a casino? When you show up, they take you to a table that's usually separated from all of the other tables, and usually it's full of gambly degens who are either A, playing because they're wasted and want some action, B, they're trying to get unstuck from playing a no limit game from earlier, or C, people who don't want to sit at a no limit table and grind it out, but who know that if they play a PLO table, they'll get in a big pot and have a chance at doubling or tripling up. If you have a casino nearby or you're going to one sometime in the near future, you should definitely give PLO a shot. It's just a whole different ballgame, man. It can get pretty wild. Now, second, since most people have heard that PLO is a high variance game, they have this picture in their mind that the nuts are really vulnerable. Ask someone about their experience with PLO, and many times you'll get a bad beat story, or they'll remember a time where they got coolered quads over quads or something. And also, most players who have a basic understanding of PLO are aware that aces aren't a winner at showdown nearly as often as they are in no limit, which seems really weird to no limit players that have never tried PLO because obviously aces is the holy grail of starting hands. So, all of this is great and everything, but the only thing we should really be concerned about is how we can use this to play more profitably against our opponents, right? So the question is, how can we leverage this? Well, the first adjustment you can make is to start barreling more against check callers. Now, this is going to seem unnatural at first because, after all, when you don't have anything and someone is calling you, it's easy to find a lot of hands that beat you on any board texture, especially when your opponent has four cards. But let's return to what we talked about on the last slide. If what I'm saying is true, and that people are scared of getting drawn out on, since, after all, they think that the nuts always lose and bad beats are constantly happening to everyone, especially them, right? Well, then doesn't that mean that they should be more likely to get the money in fast to protect their hand, especially when they're out of position? Once you've played some PLO, it shouldn't take you very long to figure out that hand reading becomes really easy in position because generally people will let you know when you're beat, especially for the reasons we talked about. And a big mistake that I made when I first started playing, and I see a lot of students doing this as well, is that they're pretty good at c-betting, and generally they have a good idea of when they should barrel the turn too. But there's been countless times I've seen where they barrel two streets and then get scared and chicken out from firing the third barrel on the river, and then get frustrated when their opponent turns over second or third pair and takes it down. Like I've said before, one of the easiest ways to lose money in poker is to build up big pots and then give up on them later. But the other side of that is that one of the easiest ways to make money playing poker is to force your opponents to give up on big pots on later streets. Now, beyond the benefits you get from making hand reading easier, you can also value bet and barrel more confidently, because you can literally completely cross certain hands out of their range by the time you get to later streets, because it's obvious they would have played those hands fast. All of this will make more sense when we review the hand histories after this lesson, and I'll be referring to this stuff a lot throughout QuickPro. But for now, I just want you to remember that the vast majority of players you'll come across tend to play their made hands fast out of position, which means they have weak or medium strength ranges when they check call. Obviously, this varies a bit depending on board texture and player type, but we can use it as a reference point for when we talk about hand reading later. Okay, so we've talked pretty in depth about why position is so important, and how we can make life a lot tougher for our opponents if we know how to correctly use it to our advantage. But the last thing I want to mention is relative position, because I don't think it gets nearly as much attention as it should from books and training videos. Now, relative position is defined as your position in relation to the preflop raiser or the postflop aggressor, and ideally, you want the aggressive player or c-better on your left and the passive player on your right. It's basically like having the button post-flop, because you'll have the opportunity to see what everybody does before you decide what line to take. So for example, let's say a very aggressive player opened under the gun, and a fish called out of the small blind, and then you called. In this hand, you have good relative position, because there's an aggressive player on your left who's likely to c-bet a wide range of boards, and a passive player on your right who's probably going to call a wide range of c-bets. See, relative position is really useful in PLO, because almost half of the pots you're going to play will be multi-way pots. So if you don't know how to use relative position to your advantage, then you're leaving a bunch of money on the table. And we've talked a lot so far about how representing hands in PLO is a big source of where your profit comes from, right? Well, none of that changes when we're talking about relative position, okay? And actually, you can get away with a lot of bluffs that work a high percentage of the time once you get a little more comfortable with hand reading and understanding ranges more. Relative position is useful as long as you have the aggressor on your left and the passive player on your right. And in all forms of poker, anytime you can take advantage of any dead money, it's definitely going to be positive EV, and that's something that relative position definitely allows you to do.
Hey, what's going on, guys? Casino Crime here. Now, if you like this video and you want more, then go ahead and click the subscribe button below right now. And if you want to join me for more of my 6 max success secrets and free video tutorials, just click the link to the right. See you inside the trainings. Good luck.